Welcome to The Way the World Works, where the trusted team behind the Tuttle Twins books tackles current events, hot topics, and fun ideas to help your family find clarity in a world full of confusion.
Hi, Katie.
Hey, Brittany.
So we're going to talk about French farmers today, which is
Is-
something I don't think that's ever come up in conversation with
Have you
me,
ever
with
said those
anybody.
words before?
I have not. No, I have definitely not said those words. What's fun though, they're in the region of Brittany. I think they say Bretagne there, or
Ah,
no, I think it is Brittany, and that's my mom. Before every single other mother in 1985 named their daughter Brittany, my mom thought it was such a unique and original name, and she loved French. And now everybody has my name, but it's my name
yours
is
is
spelled
spelled.
specifically.
Yeah, that's what I was
Yes.
going to say. You have a unique spelling.
I have a unique spell. I have the correct spelling technically, and in fact, my family says every syllable, so they call me Brittany. And I used to tell people that, and then I was like, I sound ridiculous having people call me that by Brittany,
That's
not Brittany.
adorable, though, because it's a different name. It's not
I
Brittany.
think it's a better name. I think it is a better name. Sorry to other Brittany's out there who just say it Brittany, but I like Brittany. I think it's a better name, but I have a biased
Okay,
opinion.
so mark me on every podcast from now on. I'm going to call you Brittany.
Okay, I'm gonna hold you to that. So we digress. All this to say,
Oh, yeah.
we're gonna talk about some farmers today who are revolting against the government. And I feel like we don't hear a lot of like liberty protests coming out of France these days, which is interesting because they used to be big revolutionaries
Hmm.
inspired by America, but very misguided. They were definitely socialists. It was a weird time. They had several revolutions all back to back, but we did get people like Frederick Bastiat out of that, right? So
Right.
there are some great liberty thinkers in France, but now we have these country farmers who are taking a stand. So in December, protests broke out as these farmers were getting really mad because there was like a government tax increase and there was all these regulations in the farming industry that was making it harder for them to do their job. And it was funny because they all took to their tractors. So if you Google the footage, it's like a bunch of like farmers on very slow moving tractors honking their horns. And it's kind of funny to watch, but they took things one step further. They weren't just holding signs. They have these machines that spray like manure on the field. And manure is, of course, I guess dung is what you would say, right? It's different
Yes.
animal waste that helps plants grow. And they were spraying it in on government buildings, and like it was piled high in the streets. And I can't even imagine what that smelled like. I don't want to imagine what that smelled like because I'm sure it was not good at all. But it's kind of fun to see. I know I always like to see a good protest against the government because I think it's a good reminder to them who's really in charge. You know, it is technically our government. And so I think I think they're important. I think things like that are very important. And it's also kind of a fun little analogy of flinging feces on government buildings, which
You
is
know,
interesting.
I have to think about what would happen um, if that were to happen here in the United States. So I don't know what all the consequences were, but I do always have this impression I guess that and maybe it's because of France's long history of revolution and protest, but I see protests like that happening in France, and I wonder if American farmers were to do that, if they were to roll up on Washington D.C. and cover, the Capitol building with cow manure. I don't know that they would get away with it. Like
I
I
don't think
feel
they
like,
would. No.
right? Like we've reached a point now where are we less free than the French? I don't know.
I think
But
the French also are very like they just have that personality, you know, of like
mhm,
you know.
yeah, but it's interesting to think about. Like I think that there would be really serious consequences if farmers were to protest in that way here.
I think it's possible they would be labeled domestic terrorists
Mhm.
because I think that's kind of the catch-all since 9/11. It's become like, all right, if you do anything against the federal government, you're a domestic terrorist, even, you know, parents in school board meetings. And so
Mhm.
I think that would likely be what happens. And if you're tried as a domestic terrorist, you face a lot of pretty scary consequences. So that's a really good point I didn't think of. I don't think people would get away with it, which is interesting because you and I talked before we hit record about the parallels between this and the Boston Tea Party, which is fun because they both happened in December. I
Right.
mean, well, one of them happened in 1773, but the other one
250
happened,
years apart.
yes, 250 years apart. That's right, exactly. So it's interesting. It kind of reminds us of that, you know, rough and tough American colonial spirit of we're not going to take this anymore, which I both talked about being kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. And even their form of protest, it was messy and disruptive, but not harmful to people,
Violent.
right?
Yeah.
So it really, there are a lot of similarities.
And I love when that happens. I love when you see some of that influence still present in society today, especially since, like I said, France actually really loved America. They loved our revolution. And even though they got a lot of it wrong, they were very much inspired by what was going on in the colonies because their revolution wasn't too far after. And I think it
Mhm.
was Thomas Jefferson was actually very much inspired by their inspiration, but again, not supportive of what it did because they were just going around killing nobles and royalty, which nonviolent revolutions are
Yeah.
ideal. Beheadings are frowned
Not the
upon.
best way.
Again, not the best way, not a good way to go about things. But there's a lot of symbolism here. Again, they're sending this message. They've been ignored, and what can you not ignore? And that's definitely flinging manure onto buildings. We're tossing tea into the harbor. And we talked about this before we hit record. Also, that Connor pointed out in his Tuttle Twins newsletter that it was kind of a little delightful parallel to see that happening, and it was inspirational to see that small groups of people are still standing up for what was right, just like our ancestors in America did with the Boston Tea Party. And I don't know, Katie, I feel like we don't see that a lot anymore.
I don't think so either. And I wonder sometimes if what we saw happen with the January 6th riots or whatever, everybody calls them something different depending on how they feel about them. But I feel like that really kind of laid a foundation for people to be even more fearful of um, speaking out or protesting. Like, I don't feel like we've had very many protests, at least from the, maybe we would say like the right leaning crowd since then. Like, I think that the crackdown on the people who were at the Capitol that day has really been a deterrent to people speaking out or protesting.
Well, and in addition to that, you have I know the January 6th thing is more controversial in how people view it, but you also have the trucker protests that
Hmm.
happen in Canada. And to me, I really loved that. I thought it was really cool to see, kind of the backbone of not
Yeah.
just of America or Canada, but of all countries. These truck drivers are bringing goods in between our countries and making sure we have the supplies we need. I don't think we realize how many of the items on the shelves in grocery stores are because of truck drivers. And here you had them again peacefully protesting and saying, this isn't fair what you're doing with the forced vaccinations.
Hmm.
But to me, that was really inspiring because again, it's not one of those things that we see a lot every day. But of course, what happened with that one, Katie? The government shut it down. Not only the government shut it down, people's bank accounts, not even the truck drivers' bank accounts of people who were donating to their cause
Yeah,
were shut down.
it was very personal and very severe retribution for what essentially was a peaceful protest. I mean, yeah, it was disruptive, but again, it didn't cause harm to people. It didn't destroy property. It was essentially farmers refusing to work. And they were, yeah, they were penalized for it. So again, like, I mean, I guess we need to check more. I don't know what ended up, if there was a consequence for the French farmers and the manure. Like, I don't think so. I think that
No, I didn't
they
see
just,
anything about that when I was looking
yeah,
through it. What's
and the
what's interesting
government just took
too,
it.
they just kind of took it. I don't know if they got what they wanted, but they took it. The other thing about the truck drivers that I was thinking about too is how they were quickly framed as people who probably supported January 6th.
Yes, they
Like it
were. And
became anybody who stood up and did these protests must also be for that.
yeah, or again, an insurrectionist, a domestic terrorist. So we're seeing this label applied to places it doesn't actually apply at all. It's simply, if every form of even peaceful but disruptive protest can be labeled as an insurrection or as, a domestic terrorism act, then what recourse do people have to say I don't like this?
There's really no First Amendment. You are just the term, domestic terrorist and everything that goes along with it is almost an affront, a disgrace to our First Amendment, agree to or a right to assemble. And
Mhm.
one of the most interesting things about that is during COVID, we saw people, and by people I mean government politicians, using COVID as a reason to trample on our rights, just as they do with
Mhm.
any emergency. And so this very important right to assemble that allowed, the Boston Tea Partiers to do what they did, that right was suspended in the name of getting COVID when it came to churches protesting, not even churches protesting, when it came to churches meeting, even outside singing hymns. One of those
Mhm.
groups were busted and fined. But then you had, of course, all the Black Lives Matter protests, which
Right.
were not only seen as fine, but I don't know if you remember the headlines, Katie, that it was like, oh, political protests are fine, but not church,
But
not
only this
this,
kind of political
but
protest
only this
because
kind of, yeah.
yeah,
It's it,
it's pretty crazy. I do love the parallels between the truckers in Canada and the French farmers and the Boston Tea Party. Like what all of them did was disrupt infrastructure, and they disrupted people being able to get the supplies that they needed. I guess in the Boston Tea Party, it's interesting because they shut down the ports, and I think we
yeah,
talked
it's
about
almost
it in our
opposite. Yeah, in a little
yeah,
bit.
it's
Yeah.
almost opposite because it was the British government that said, "Okay, well, you can't use this port until you pay back all of the cost for the tea that you wasted." And that was a hardship because when people can't get supplies, you know, they become maybe less convicted in their protest or in what they're willing to put up with when there's no food coming in and
Yep.
they can't put food on the table. And so that's kind of how England tried to bully the colonists into giving up. But then it's also, the French farmers and the truckers kind of tried to use that same method to disrupt people's basic needs so that they could be heard and so that they could bring about changes that they didn't feel like they had power to bring about in any other way.
What's interesting, I was so we did an episode about a year ago on the Dutch farmer protests, and the
Hmm.
Dutch were protesting there, and like not not flinging manure, but they were still. I think they actually were throwing some things like fruit or something. I don't remember what it was at government buildings, and they were protesting because the government was passing laws about climate that were impacting not only the farmers but the food people could get. So they were saying because of carbon emissions, you have to kill 30% of your livestock
Yes.
and things like that. And so they revolted. And I just was doing a quick search and I saw that German farmers at the end of December were also revolting, and that we had Indian farmers who were revolting a couple years ago. And so the government keeps passing these laws that hurt farmers. And we need to be careful about that because farmers are the reason we have food. And it kind of reminds me during the New Deal with the Great Depression when farmers also got hurt because they were like paying them not to farm. It's
Hmm.
funny to me. We should never go after the farmers because of how much they impact our lives. I mean, it's crazy.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this happen. And one thing that I wish I had for you that I don't is the conclusion to these protests, some of the ones that happened before. So, I like to give you guys homework assignments on these episodes. So that's a fun little assignment. See if you can find out how many of these protests actually worked and what happened to them. So awesome. We will leave it there. We'll wrap it up, guys. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And until next time, we will talk to you later.
Bye, Brittany.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Way the World Works. Make sure your family is subscribed and check out TuttleTwins.com for more awesome content.